Hey everyone. Hopefully you guys can hear me and everything's okay. Just gonna wait a few minutes to get some more people back in, ran into some troubleshooting errors. Oh yeah, we're getting people in now. Cool. Just a few more minutes. Sweet. Hey Gudomon. All right. Let's give it a few more minutes. How's the audio by the way? Does it sound okay? Are you hearing any pops? Awesome. Okay, good to hear. Crispy. Right. Sweet. All right, I think we can slowly get going, and then hopefully, if anybody else joins, they'll be caught up to speed um, by the tail end. But yep, cool. But yeah, so thanks everyone for tuning in. Um, I know we had some troubleshooting errors to start us off with, so not the smoothest start, but I think we can manage. And yeah, just as a heads up, we'll have some time for questions um, as we move forward. So if you guys are asking questions on the chat, I'm going to be addressing them and just kind of keeping them in the mind. And then by the end of it, we can kind of tackle some of them. And yeah, so today, I just want to give a broader introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name's Abe Taraki. I'm a concept designer, illustrator working in the film, game, and animation industries. It's a lot of industries. I hope you guys are enjoying Lightbox 2021. I know there's a lot of really good talks happening. So, I appreciate you guys hopping on the stream to chat and just kind of go over some of the kind of concepts and workflows, but also some of the mindset kind of tweaks and adjustments that I've been using to kind of navigate a post-COVID world, but then also continue like my artistic progression throughout my career. And hopefully there are some tips and tricks that you guys can use as takeaways and they're helpful to you. And in more specific terms, I wanted to talk about how we can kind of jumpstart our artistic endeavors when they're stagnating. And the way we can do that potentially is by taking some risks, asking some honest questions, and then failing, of course, and what sort of successes we can find at the tail end of that process. And, just to give you a little bit of background on why I chose this topic, I myself have had to kind of branch out and reinvent um, a lot of, oh, just jumped ahead, a lot of my process and a lot of my pipelines throughout production in both my personal work and in my professional work many times. And the reasoning for that was just to kind of to handle larger problems and to kind of stand the test of time, you have to adapt. This is kind of like a very natural thing. And so to address those challenges, I've had to kind of develop almost this mindset of constantly adapting. And yeah, like I said, as we go through this, there's some takeaways for you guys, and they're meaningful in some regard. But let's kind of talk about stagnation. Like, how does one become stagnant in art? Don't we just kind of sit around and come up with like endless streams of ideas? So isn't that a pretty deep well? And that's kind of the misconception because there's definitely a finite amount of energy and like processing power you have in your mind when you're kind of handling any sort of artistic endeavor. You're just thinking about what to do next, and that expels a lot of energy. And so, how do you become stagnant? And to become stagnant, it's essentially a lack of change, you know? Um, and so, for instance, some of you guys might fit into this category or another one, but I'd be curious to hear if some of this is applicable to you. Maybe your job hasn't evolved and is greatly outpaced by the artistic interests you have. So you're already working in the industry and you've kind of hit the ceiling in your job. Or maybe your comfort zone has kind of given you all of your sources of affirmation. So, we see a lot of artists doing amazing things in social media, but they definitely have a branding to their work. And so anything outside of that branding is sort of taboo. And, you have this fear of traversing that uncharted territory. Or maybe you're just an artist trying to kind of initiate this first phase in your career and kind of break in, but your understanding of the industry is limited. So you're constantly doing the same thing over and over again. And so basically, what I'm alluding to with all these examples is that you could be a student, you could be breaking into the industry, you could be a seasoned artist having worked on multiple productions. Stagnating in art is one of those issues that doesn't discriminate. It hits all artists, regardless of your successes or capabilities, the same. And it affects you at different phases in your career. So, why does it occur? Is this just a natural thing that happens to everybody, or is there a specific practice that you can avoid to avoid this? Unfortunately, as with anything, the longer you do it, the more insight and the more experience you gain. And so you'll see that in art, it's no different. As you move forward with your career or put a little bit of time investment into it, immediately you'll find that change is a very natural part of it. And that change, or lack of sometimes, begins to manifest itself in sort of routines and familiarity because we're kind of creatures of habit. And so you start developing artistic comfort zones. And so I want to talk a little bit about how art is no exception. Building these comfort zones is kind of leading you down this path of what stagnation is. And so, jumping off that point, well, routine and familiarity, if you really enjoy doing a set type of work, that's not a bad thing at all. Over time, if you do the same thing over and over and over again, like having the same lunch for a year, which I've done, it gets boring at some point. And so it's just kind of akin to that. So let's use an example. For instance, in modern day film studios, right? Like these giant corporations, they have these annual and quarterly evaluations of their upcoming slate, like projects that they're going to pour millions and millions of dollars into. And much like them, when they do that sort of audit, we have to be very honest with ourselves and we have to be aware that today's solutions aren't going to work for tomorrow's problems. And so, unlike us, these studios, what they do is they pay a lot of money to a lot of people in order to do a pulse check. And that pulse check on themselves and on their environment allows them to kind of get insight into how does the outside world, how would they work or react to our future projects? How would we culturally, as a brand, kind of benefit or lose out on certain endeavors that we have planned? And in the same way as individuals, we have to kind of do our own pulse checks. We have to ask ourselves the tough questions, and sometimes they're very painful. Um, and so if you've seen, a lot of my work, it shifts. in subject matter, in style, in technique. Um, and it's just because I like to do those pulse checks and I like to pivot a lot. And so let's talk a little bit about what it what that process involves. What is a pulse check? So step one, as with any sort of self, improvement plan, you've already taken step one. You agree that, hey, I've been doing the same thing. I'm kind of stuck in a rut, and I have to initiate the process of being kind of this brutal, honest question making. I have to like find those answers. And for me, what works is just relying on a couple of key specific pointed questions. And all these pointed questions stem from risk, right? Risk assessment. Risk assessment is really important because, as artists, we put a lot of ourselves into the work that we generate. So risk is included in every piece, whether you knowingly or unknowingly imbue it into a piece, it's already there. And so you're already risking change. You're risking exposing a piece of yourself, vulnerability that maybe you don't want to risk, but it's right there in your image. And if you risk, you're of course risking letting yourself down based on your expectations of what success is. So let's talk about some of these questions that point out what some of these risks are. And so risk of change is like a really big one. And it's something that unintentionally I've been faced with a lot. A lot of times, mentally in the content we make, games take anywhere from 3 to 6 years sometimes to make. Films could take months on end to work on, and personal projects could take years. And so as a result of that, it's very easy to get tied up with pipeline, with workflow, with, just staying true to that initial step that you took and not wanting any sort of change. So being afraid, the fear of the unknown, is a very powerful motivator to not do anything. And so I like to think of it as all of us artists are kind of different degrees of a chameleon. Kind of like the covers of those books. And I'm not sure if you guys know this, but the Animorph books, those books? And so in those books, you'd have like a chameleon, like an animal on one end, and then you'd have like a human on the other end, and then you'd have all sorts of horrible transitions in the middle, like all these mutated creatures. And apparently that middle part was supposed to serve as a transition from one to the other. And so when I think about being a chameleon, I think about like that horrible anamorph spectrum. And, not to knock the artwork, but just the idea of someone turning into a chameleon is terrifying. And so, yeah, so how are you willing to adapt, to learn, to be part of something that's unfamiliar? And so for me, my level of adaptiveness stems from my parents. My parents are immigrants. This has kind of formed them into a highly adaptive people. They're bold. They risk a lot in hopes of gaining some sort of level of stability and security for their family. I learned that being that malleable from watching them really served me a great deal earlier in my career. I actually have a background in animation. I hail from Canada, and I went to school in Sheridan, which is an animation school there in Canada. And after graduating, I kind of graduated back into my old interest of concept art. And concept art was just a very foreign concept. There's illustration, there's animation, but concept art was definitely a new thing. And not many animation studios had wanted to take that sort of pivot and wanted to kind of gain more experience in the gaming industry. And I'm not sure if you guys know a lot about this, but in the gaming industry, when you're starting out, sometimes you're not necessarily doing the type of work that you want to do. And so you're really picking up a lot of different skills, you're wearing different hats. And so oftentimes that meant moving to cities where I didn't speak the language, or I wasn't familiar with the job, but I was, highly motivated to kind of get as close as possible to the type of work that I was a fan of. And so that level of change and just kind of focus really me something about myself. You know, I am willing to be full anamorph baby, full chameleon, if it's for, you know, furthering my artistic vision. And so when we talk about risk, you know, we also need to talk about the risk within your art. What makes me the most vulnerable? What's the risk in my content? You have to identify what's unique to you and figure out what your value system is. And so, what works for me is when I decided to kind of shift and pivot to a different style, you know, for instance, the images here. At work, I was doing very hyper realistic stuff and I wanted to just kind of shift things. I begin by, you know, asking me what makes me more vulnerable. And vulnerability is very important because it connects with people. And so that's risky because as soon as you put in any of your vulnerabilities in your work, you're kind of just, you know, laying out your heart on the table. And there is a tendency to kind of put it all out there. And so that's the type of risk you're taking there. You know, in specific, you know, I'm a minority. And so I don't find that there are a lot of voices hailing from like an Afghani or you know, specifically the type of Middle Eastern culture that I stem from. And so what I like to do is that I like to identify that, oh, if I am incredibly motivated by that sort of culture, what other cultures, you know, that maybe are lesser known, what other cultures can I incorporate into my work? And so sometimes it results in work. Maybe that's not the most popular or the most center stage topic, in social media, but the subject matter speaks to me the strongest, you know, and it keeps me on a momentum to want to continue to generate the work, tell stories, and hopefully, you know, bring some awareness and educate people a little bit. You know, and a good example of this is I published a book. It's called Ideal. It has a number of different sketches that you know, draw inspiration from African culture, Afghani culture, Filipino culture. And so just bringing to light some costume design and some interesting personality, some colors and shapes from something that's very close to me, you know, a vulnerability that I have as a minority, but I'm using that as kind of a fuel. And so I highly recommend using that as an opportunity to deviate away from stagnation, maybe putting more of yourself into the work. And so if we're talking about risk and we're talking about the risk of change, we're talking about you know, the risk of the content you're putting out, your vulnerabilities. Let's talk about stakes, right? Let's talk about high stake and low stakes when you're putting out work. You have to evaluate the effort and the effect, whether it's short term and long term. And that's going to give you a bigger picture view of what you need to do in order to, you know, see what you're going to get out of this endeavor. You know, if you're stagnating, you want to know if it's going to be worth the difficult and iterative process of changing, and also what you might lose in that process of change, because that's, you know, also a very logical thing to think about. So, for example, you could be, you know, as I mentioned before, a social media powerhouse and have a very specific brand that's tied to your following. But a sudden shift in content may risk alienating the audience that is used to your brand specific art. So, that's definitely a viable risk that you're going to be taking. Or at the same time, if you're relocating, you know, from one job to another, but the new job is in a foreign country, you know, the job could provide a higher ceiling in comparison to, you know, your current position, but it might also bring with it barriers such as language or culture. So, you know, so assessing the short term and long term effects of the risk we take within our art and our professional artistic careers is very important. And this assessment isn't meant to kind of deter you from taking these risks, but to isolate the negative effects early on so you can counter them and reduce their impact when you move forward with the risks. And of course, we have to talk about failure. So failure is super terrifying. Failure is, um, it's kind of the epitome of what you don't want to happen when you take great risk. It's no surprise that many, myself included, would consider failing with our art as kind of like this dark cloud that we need to avoid. Even if it sometimes means I'd rather just do what I'm good at. I'd rather not change that because to fail at something else is just much more devastating. But one thing that I've learned in my career is that failure goes hand in hand with putting yourself out there. And you might know a lot of direct or indirect examples of this, but the way I look at failure is I look at it in a very analytical way. I help dilute it to kind of boil it down to key takeaways. These takeaways, are things that I learned from, and those lessons learned are going to help me make more calculated risks because, at the end of the day, not every failure can be avoided. And so, in having this almost shamelessness with failure, we kind of bypass the social stigma of always hitting like a 10 out of 10. And this deals more with being bold and and just kind of taking those lessons in risk taking, but applying it to your work without the fear of having that social constraint. So, for example, like most of the kids, when I was young, I would love watching kung fu movies. Like I loved watching Jackie Chan films in particular. I'm sure most of you did. And in those films, the one of the best things was the blooper reel. And it wasn't necessarily a blooper reel when I look back. It was more so like just watching people get hurt and fail at the stunts that they would do. And I remember I didn't enjoy it because, I wanted to see people, go through pain and suffering, but I wanted to kind of see when they failed, at what take did it actually work out? And sometimes you would see them go through like the third and fourth and fifth take. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of takes, but mind you, some of the stunts are like jumping from a building to the other building and then through a helicopter, just some crazy stuff. And so that was very inspirational to me because, and of course, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but really, like you feel invested in their success. And so, in the same way, you try to kind of learn from that powerful lesson. And, to continue the theme of Kung Fu movies, there's this like interesting quote that I heard a long time ago. I don't know where I heard it, but it's a quote from Bruce Lee, who, is a man of many interesting quotes. But he says, great attempts, in great attempts, it is glorious even to fail. And I found that very interesting because with your art, you have to fail so many times. Many of the projects I personally have dedicated years and years of my life to were never lifted off the ground. But they educated me. They educated my decisions for the next project. And even though I would continue to take these major risks in my art, I now knew the boundaries. I now knew where I should kind of set those limiters. So assessing risk and then also addressing those failures and kind of achieving those failures helps let you know where those boundaries are. And over time, they shift, which is why we should always do these audits on ourselves, just do these pulse checks time and time again. Okay, am I at the stage in my artistic career to explore more bolder themes, things that interest me, and then I should just go and pursue them? Oh, it's not the right time because maybe I don't have the technical skill or I don't have the, historical knowledge to kind of put into the work in order to really sell it accurately in accordance with what I'm imagining. And so I think, failure is definitely it seems like a limiter, but it definitely is one of those things that should like liberate you because after you fail, there's nowhere else to go but up. And so that's definitely something that I've always kept really close to me. And so let's talk. Oh, jumped ahead. Let's talk a little bit about success because eventually, if you failed enough, like I have, You want some of your failures to kind of rack up and those lessons learned to potentially lead you down the road of success. And so, we've talked about if you're stagnating as an artist, what stagnation is. We've talked about the fear of change. We've talked about how often that's keeping us from growing and elevating the ceilings that are boxing us in. And then we've also talked about the risks and putting ourselves into the work, even with the possibility of failing. So all of this is, well covered. But let's say you took a shot, you went for it, and you did like a very gutsy move. You have all your followers, or you have exactly the style you want to hit, but let's say there's no studio doing that style. Like that's a big risk, and you're committing to it. You know the failures, you know the risks, and you've assessed those risks. But then you ask yourself, why hasn't this developed into something bigger? Because you did all those things and you're satisfied with your art, but suddenly you want it to resonate more with people because as artists, we want affirmation. And so, yeah, why isn't anyone else taking notice of something I sincerely enjoy? And this is an example that I think a lot of us see where artists of all different experience levels start working on their personal projects. There's an initial like rocket fuel that's driving them in finally taking those risks and fueling their art in a meaningful way. But then the expectation turns to maybe that personal project being a box office hit. And so that lesson is really important because I think it's important to take a step back. I think it's important to write your definition of success or at least note it. And what I mean by that is I think it's important to keep in mind the initial goals you had from the get-go. And they should weigh you heavily towards what the definition of success means. If you don't do this, you're just going to end up back to that initial point where you've identified, oh yeah, I'm stagnating. I'm just plateauing. My art is the same. I put so much of my investment. I'm so far deep that I might as well stay in the casino. And I think this last step is you just cashing your chips. I think you need to know when a project or a certain phase or a certain theme you're exploring that you've gone and put a lot of effort into, when it's time to kind of accept the fact that the successes that you had were very specific to the goals that you had from the get-go. And so when you identify the failed state and when you identify your success, it's very clear what the outcome of an endeavor is. For example, my partner and I, we pitched to studios. In our first pitch, we had unintentionally, and I say unintentionally because we didn't mean to, it just happened, pitch an idea to a really big studio executive. And the first idea was so well liked that we just suddenly ended up in conference calls with entire executive teams talking about the idea and just kind of seeing where we could develop it. And as we started to put our time slowly, hours after work, days, we would between jobs just kind of focus on that idea and just really put a lot of our personal investment into the characters, into the world. And the themes were so close to our hearts that we were genuinely excited to share that with everybody else. The excitement was palpable. But it just wasn't the right time. And so swiftly our like legs were just cut right from underneath us. And at the time it was kind of devastating because you had invested so much. The pitch was shelved and we were extremely disappointed. But what we didn't realize was we had forgotten about our initial goals with the pitch. The initial goal wasn't to necessarily just have a hit and develop it. Of course, that's always in the back of your mind. But it was more so to kind of get an idea as to what the process was. Going through just a loose set of ideas to like a solid kind of collaborative effort that was this like huge art bible that had a pilot script that had all of these different elements. That was just such a gratifying process. And That pitch essentially circulated around a bunch of different networks. Our confidence grew. And while we were realizing, you know, all these failures and we were super disappointed and depressed, we had, unbeknownst to us, put our foot in the door and got it like tightly shut right on our foot. But we were so preoccupied with the pain that we didn't know the door was open, essentially. And so show development opened up for us. Um, this example is just to kind of show that sometimes, the more immediate pain masks the long-term success. And so my hope is that sometimes what you perceive as a failed state in something is just a temporary emotional state that you have, and instead looking at the factual breakdown of takeaways is going to help elevate your art. And I just want to hit on a couple other points, just because I see that a bunch of other people joined in the chat. You know, it's very easy for us to put ourselves in a routine and gravitate towards familiarity. I know I do it. I have a newborn son, and when he sometimes develops new behavior, for us to go and react a certain way, that expectation is always there. So he expects our reaction to be the same. Because, as humans, we just want to maintain the status quo. We want to be comfortable. And change involves a lot of discomfort. But sometimes change also involves a lot of growth. So asking yourself honest questions like, is the risk that I'm taking with my art, what sort of positive outcomes can that have? How can I motivate myself to ensure that I'm not plateauing? And then also identifying the differences between failure and different degrees of success. This is going to really, really help you in keeping in mind what your artistic path looks like for your ventures. In doing this, you're going to have developed a mechanism to kind of self-start your own artistic kind of drained battery. It's very easy to get burnt out. You might have heard that term thrown throughout the industry. People get burnt out all the time. In identifying what's the kind of supercharged mechanism that helps you get going, what's the carrot on the stick that gets you started in generating art, that's how we can kind of become self-sufficient. You're no longer going to be as dependent on outside affirmation and instead be much more self-reliant. And I always like to think of our field as a field of longevity. There's amazing artists, always entering the field, younger artists, or sometimes, super hidden talents that, you just didn't know existed, but suddenly, they appear. And I've seen a lot of like bright stars, friends of mine, like just go through the ebbs and flows in the industry and then just slowly kind of fade out. And I think, the reason for that is we all start on the same road. It's just really those that are able to sustain staying on that road that end up being those great artists that we look up to. And so I hope that that's kind of a positive takeaway. I know a lot of people, especially by attending Lightbox, you show great interest in attending these talks and kind of brushing up on a lot of techniques and stuff. But I hope that this talk, generally discussing how we can stay motivated and how we can kind of change or adapt, it might help you. I know I've had to develop this over time and be, significantly less reliant on outside sources, those outside affirmation mechanisms that help kind of sway us one way or another. Because I think art should be very personally gratifying as well. That's why we got into the field. That's why we're not doctors. Not to say that doctors aren't, they get gratification out of their work, but I mean, we don't. We're artists. And so our goal is to identify what mechanism, what aspect of our art at any given time resonates with us, and then use that mechanism to constantly fuel ourselves. Because it's very easy to rely on outside mechanisms, as I said. And yeah, so, that's just a very brief talk that I kind of wanted to go over. I wanted to save some time for like a brief Q&A session as well, because a lot of people have been asking some really good questions. So I'm just going to sift through chat and see what you all have to say. All right. Cool. So, sorry if I mispronounce your name. Lou Sam Hildenash. That's an interesting name. It says similar finished art school, went into advertisement after a lull and struggle to ignite my motivation, mental ups and downs. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, right? Like you go into a certain field expecting and wanting very specific things, but what ends up happening is, reality sinks in. So to be self-sufficient is to be outside reliant on, factors that you control. You're not a servant of circumstance. You're not just waiting there for something to happen at work, or you're not waiting for something to happen, in social media. You're going to be personally gratified for the work that you produced. I hope that you've continued in your artistic endeavors, though, Lou. Jeff Hill says, "Gotta know what lunch did you have for a year?" I had every table curry bowls, and they were good from like Monday to Tuesday at one point, just 2 days. And then Wednesday to Friday, I just wanted the weekend to come faster and faster. And I didn't know why that was happening. And I realized it was my lunch. I was dreading lunchtime from Wednesday to Friday. So every table curry bowls, they're good, but long term, I'm not so sure. We see a lot of Canadians here in the chat. Hello, Canada. Someone's asking why they're chatting as John Lennon. I'm not sure. I don't know. We have a question here from Ariana. Ariana says, with so many opportunities and so many options nowadays, everything and anything all of the time, what is a good way to find your path in a position you like without being overwhelmed by everything? Yeah, that's a great question. We have we have like an overexposure of everything, so I definitely have that same feeling. I am not an authority on social media. I have a very tricky relationship with social media. I personally keep a lot of my private life and a lot of my own personal um, work and just endeavors outside of social media. And the reason for that is um, I just think quieting a little bit of that noise helps sometimes focus. Um, if you're aiming to find a path or a position that you like without being overwhelmed, as you ask, I would say um, it depends on your goals. If you're trying to land a position in this field, identify what the requirements are, and then just go do what you need to do in terms of, learning the technical side of things, elevating your artistic skills, networking, and just identify those things. And sometimes for me, I'll write them down. What are the mechanisms that will help me get to the goal that I want to get to? And in that sense, self, um, you're really self-sufficient, and you're really not depending on social media norms. You're not depending on, okay, if that person did it this way, then I'm going to do it that way. What you're relying on is your particular situation and how you would go about doing those things. But it doesn't hurt to have knowledge from other people's experience. And so that's why I say having a very measured and controlled relationship with social media helps for me, is because I can learn from my contemporaries. I can learn from my colleagues. I can see some great art that's being developed, and I can see where trends and things are going. But at the same time, just knowing those things isn't really going to impact the type of work that I do. In going through some of the questions that we went over in our talk, you build a confidence. And I think that's what might help you, is just kind of going through the process and building your own confidence to action on what you really want. Hopefully that answers your question. Francisco V asks, are failures and successes more apparent in hindsight? Absolutely. Yeah. And I think going through enough of them, you're going to be able to identify what the tell is for a failure or a success. Like if you've gone through a bunch of personal projects and you've identified that maybe I shouldn't expect each one to be box office hit, then that's going to, that level of past failure is going to give you some identifiers in the future that if you do another project, you should set some realistic goals and then just see where things go. And same with successes. So understanding what past limitations and successes are going to help you identify them in the future. So it's going to make it clear over time. So it just comes with time. Lou asks, how do you deal with the double-edged sword of being a chameleon and finding yourself? Oh yeah, this is a really good question because when we're going through some form of education, whether you're self-taught or going through traditional schooling, there is this consensus that you should specialize. And I think it's really important to specialize and figure out what your interests are. But I think it is such a competitive, if we're talking in terms of just jobs, by the way, it is such a competitive field that sometimes you have to be a chameleon professionally to get your foot in the door in terms of just those hard and soft skills. So for instance, getting some exposure as to what game development or film production or animation production looks like. It may not be the exact thing you want to do. So, it may not be finding yourself, but maybe through that trial and error run and exposing yourself to those things, you do learn a couple things about yourself. And then over time, you have the luxury of specializing because you've built upon that broad range of experience. So starting out as more of a chameleon and just kind of being open to adapting to a lot of things is going to let you know what you want to do. And it's going to give you a lot more of those answers. Gudamon asks, how does one get to a God of War level quality concept artist? What advice would you give to a younger you? Thank you for this, man. Honored to have this talk. Oh, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, my art path wasn't typical. I would bounce around between different industries and different types of titles. I would jump through different types of styles. Uh, and most of the time, to be honest, it was on my terms, but I would do it for just sheer survival. Like those were the jobs available, and I had to learn a new skill set in order to, make a living. But I would say to get to that level of quality, I would highly recommend that you just build a really good portfolio and iterate on it. It really helps to iterate on a portfolio, see where the weaker pieces are, take a little bit of a break, come back, maybe develop your eye, and get exposed to more work. Events like these are really great. Lightbox is awesome. You get to see what other artists are doing. You get to go to panels and talk about techniques. That all really helps feed your level of expertise. And then you go back to your work and really ask those questions and iterate on them, because you shouldn't hold work dear if your goal is to get to a really high caliber. It's going to take a lot of thrown away drawings. I remember when I was in animation school, we would do like a 12-second animation, and sometimes you're looking at like hundreds of drawings, and each one of those drawings you like slave over, and maybe at the end you're doing cleanup. So it's kind of that mileage idea. But at the same time, you're staying conscious of, what the other question was asking, which is what your personal tastes are. And so as you get your skills up to a certain level and your tastes up to a certain level, you're going to have both of those things and you'll have something really special to you. And I think everybody on our team in particular has found a complementary specialization that helps the whole of the games that we make. And so you'll find the same thing. You might really love doing environments or creatures, but you'll only know if you start doing other things and just getting in that mileage and iterating on your portfolio. Uh, Hippoland says, Hypoland, how to study and not lose the will to draw. Sometimes when I'm studying, I don't want to draw later because I punish myself for not being good enough yet. Oh, okay, good question. Uh, that's a tough one because, I said like you have a very finite amount of energy in any given day. And so it's very important to take stock of how much you're distributing. If you're really starting out earlier on, you're going to expel that energy very quickly. Simple tasks, just singular designs, let's say in a job or in your schoolwork, in this case, are going to exert all of that energy, all of that mental brain power. And so it's really tough to keep yourself motivated. But I think as you do more of it, it becomes easier and you become more efficient. So you lose less energy as you're doing those tasks. The key is keep yourself motivated long enough to get through enough iterations until you don't feel every drawing, every design that you do. And then that's going to help you because, nobody likes, you know, going to, let's say, the gym and completely falling apart every time. But if you maintain that persistence, you built up the muscle strength and the endurance. And so that level of endurance is similar in art. You just have to stay with it long enough and know how to kind of trick yourself into doing it over and over again. Keeping things low stakes also really helps for me. Like not making your mind think that the next thing you do is going to be the greatest thing in the world. That puts a lot of pressure on you and it makes it so that you box yourself in. So that would be kind of my recommendation. Ace says, are you planning to add content to this channel from time to time? Loved your talk. Oh, thank you so much, Ace. I'm not used to streaming that often, you know, if you didn't notice already. But it would be nice to kind of get a couple of things out. I'm not definitely the type of artist that, is going to be there 3 times a week with new updates, but I'm going to try, make it more of a habit to connect with younger artists and just kind of talk about some of these things because they're not talked about too often, I find. It's just a lot of discussions and talks revolve around breaking into the industry and then just very specific technical stuff, but not a lot of them touch on like the broader mental states that you kind of go through, and talking a lot about the failures. Like it's a part of the job. The greatest thing I ever heard was from one of my personal heroes, Ian McKegg, and he was doing a Star Wars sketch. I forgot what it was for, but he was using sheets of mylar. And so he would do a really rough drawing and then he would do another sheet over top. And then it would be a little less rough. And then he would do another sheet over top. And he got to something like 4 or 5 sheets. And I'm like, oh my God, Ian, that looked terrible at the start and now it looks amazing. What is this secret? And he says it I remember in the video, and he's like, because the initial idea is there, you're just iterating, and it's not that you have to nail it in the first try. And that was such an amazing kind of mind-blowing thing for me to hear at the time, because I had always thought, going through traditional figure drawing, that your gesture and every line has to be intentional and it has to be perfect and beautiful. But part of concept art is like a sort of messiness, um, an iterative process by nature. And so it was quite liberating to hear that. So it'd be good to talk about that stuff. We're okay, here we go. Lydia's talking about um how do you know what to specialize in? And then she says, I, or she or he, however they want to identify it, I feel lost as an artist who studied 3D at school, but when I graduated, I spent most of my time drawing. I like it more than 3D and feel a bit lost for the future. By the way, hi from Switzerland. Oh, hi. Um, yeah, it's tricky, you know. You figure out specialization. I think we talked about this a little bit before. You figure out specialization the more you get exposure to the field or industry. I'm assuming when you talk about 3D at school, you mean maybe gaming or just 3D computer graphics or something. I think it's important to maybe incorporate some of your passion, which is I take it sketching into that sort of work. So maybe if you're doing 3D, and 3D is a pretty broad thing, but maybe let's say if you're modeling characters, maybe you should work on the concept side of things because modelers or character artists in modern day game development have to interpret design and have to come up with a lot of design on their own. And so their skill set translates to 2D quite often. I know on our teams, our guys are and gals are really amazing at just kind of translating the concepts we give, but then they're able to just kind of push it way beyond anything that was on the page before. And the way they're able to do that is they'll draw over stuff. They'll take a screenshot of their own work and just sketch over it and then go back and fix it. And at the end, they're left with something that is just much more solid than you know just kind of a concept we would deliver. So I think there's a lot of parallels. It might be worth exploring for you if that's kind of the predicament you're in. Oh, thanks, Charisse. That's nice of you to say. I'm glad there were some good takeaways. Thanks, Birdie. I really appreciate it. Glad you enjoyed the talk. Cameron, sorry I missed your question. Yeah, Cameron asks, how do you get over burnout in terms of trial and error and mostly error? Yeah, burnout is tough. If you it depends. You know, there's different types of burnout. If you're burning out on your own terms with your own personal work, it's easier to recover from that than let's say if you're obligated to constantly produce work at work and obviously you're depending on that paycheck. And so when you're burning out there, how do you recover from that? I think it's important to first acknowledge you're burning out. A lot of times, you know, I mentioned earlier that the productions we work in have, you know, 4, 3, or maybe even 6 year span. And so it's very natural to burn out. I think there's a lot of flexibility in a team setting to ask for certain things to vary it up. And then additionally, if you're burning out on your own personal work, take a break. You know, art is meant to be, if you're, especially if you're doing it personally and you're building a portfolio, it's meant to showcase the best of what you enjoy. And so if you're feeling obligated and burnt out to constantly cram content in there, and things are just not coming together, just, you know, take a break. For me, I can usually tell when I put the tablet pen on the screen if I'm there. And sometimes I like to kind of push past and do the work and just kind of call it. But those days are especially difficult because I know that I'm not producing at 100%. Um, I'm just on autopilot a little bit. And so I try to avoid those days, you know, like the plague. Because I try to motivate and do these types of self audits that we talked about in the talk in order to jumpstart so that as often as I can, I'm operating at 100%. And I think that really helps deliver top-notch work because I myself am a fan of the content I'm creating. Um, and finding what, you know, you can use to do that is that's the key. Cool. I'm just gonna go over some other questions. Yeah, so some people are asking about content on the channel. Yeah, I mean it's open-ended. We might see some more stuff fairly soon. But I'm just trying this out, so potentially there will be more videos and stuff. Um, Squibble Studios says, I am constantly comparing my work to that of others. I know it is not healthy to do so, but I don't know how to stop. How do I stop that? Yeah, welcome to what every artist has to kind of fight against. It's very easy to compare oneself with others because we see great work and immediately we're just kind of enthralled by it and we're motivated. We finally have something that looks amazing. And of course, then you look at your work and maybe the image that's in your head isn't really matching up with the level of skill set that you have to offer or the tools that you have at your disposal to put down what's in your head. And so it doesn't match what you're looking at. Very early in my artistic pursuit, I was in school at Sheridan Animation, and it was a very competitive and positive but very competitive environment. And I remember I I would look at the level of competition, but there would be this voice in the back of my head saying like this isn't the real competition. Not that there weren't amazing people, and pretty much everybody's amazing there, but it was more so like the path you're taking is more on a global scale. You're going into concept art first and foremost. The hubs for it were completely elsewhere. Like they weren't where I went to school. They weren't in my hometown. So I had to, travel for different opportunities. And at the same time, people were doing that all around the world. And so at a very early phase in my career, I kind of went on a mini pilgrimage. I came out to LA, I traveled to Montreal. I went to these hubs while I was in school, and it was just kind of shocking for everybody. Like, what are you doing? And people thought I was backpacking, but in reality, I just went briefly just to see what the bigger pond looked like. What are those parameters? How much do I really have to grow, and how do I kind of size up against people? Really early, it became evident that I don't size up at all. And that to me was exciting, and I was happy because at a certain point, I had to accept the fact that we're not going to be the greatest artist at that time. But if we strive for it, you will achieve that level of excellence. And so I think the continuous effort that you put in is what's going to be the thing that differs you from other people. It's going to be the thing that sets you apart. Well, there may be great people now. Use that as a fuel source, but don't let it get to you on a more emotional and mental level. It's meant to be more as a fuel source for you to channel through into your work. Wilderness Box says if you need to learn to render in grayscale studies, just limit what you're working on at one time. Oh, okay. He's offering advice for for someone else. That's so nice. Chat's just helping each other out. Yeah, Empress Valkyrie, how can you study efficiently without getting overwhelmed with content? Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of really great techniques and some really great classes for this. Um, it all has to do with just kind of the approach that you take when you're doing a study. For me, I like to focus on larger shapes, the general elements of design, and the principles of composition, like just very broad, and work. And a mentality that I have usually is working from like a macro view to a micro view. So I like to start with the broader elements and then slowly kind of almost figure out what those islands of information are and then incorporate design within them. I know it's really difficult to explain that verbally how to do a study, but I definitely encourage you to look up resources. I know Lightbox has had some awesome talks about sketching, about compositions and principles of design and things of that nature. So I would definitely encourage you to check them out. They might give you more accurate, like one-to-one insights on how to approach that. All right, I think we have time for one last question. So Hippoland says, Hypoland, how do you get better without feeling that you're copying mindlessly, copying the same thing? Studying from other artists feels bad sometimes. Yeah, yeah, I definitely understand. Master copies are typically how I started, looking at like really old paintings of my favorite artists. That was kind of what helped me. And the reason for that was I just felt that there was such an awesome artistic mastery and there were so many barriers, like physical barriers in applying paint on a canvas that they had to go through in order to get things, their values, their compositions, and everything looking great. And so for me, that's where I started, knowing that that's the type of art I enjoy, in the fine arts. But you can find other artists' work and do studies. I think there's no harm in that. I think, it gets tricky, especially when, it gets to, portfolios and things. But if you're doing just studies, yeah, that's no problem. I think um, imitation is really good in figuring out how to deconstruct something and then how to apply it into your own work because that mileage is something you pick up with your hand and with your mind. So you have to really kind of connect. And if you're connecting only with the works of other artists, on let's say ArtStation or something like that, then that's fine. For me, it was just the fine art masters. Looking at a lot of old Russian masters. For that type of stuff. So like Rapin is really amazing. Rembrandt paintings are really like, and each one has their own strengths. So if you look at Rembrandt, you'll get like very like elusive color and shape incorporation into your painting and how did they do that at the time through glazing and doing different glazes of paint over top of a certain layer, starting out with values and then just layering the paint over top. So you pick up a lot of things, but you also train your eye. So that's where I would start. That's how I started. I know a lot of other people do it that way too, but I'm sure there's other ways as well. Awesome. Okay. Well, I mean, that's a lot of really good questions, and I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Like I said, please enjoy the rest of Lightbox. There's still a lot of great talks and content to come. But that's it for me, and hopefully we can stay in touch, and maybe you'll see me in another video on this channel. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.